There are moments in a man's life when everything he thinks he wants disappears in the space between a phone call and a heavy sigh. For Morgan Freeman, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a cramped manager's office on the third floor of a building that smelled like old coffee and faded dreams. The note on the desk read simply, "Passed." Two handwritten words that could have crushed a lesser man, but revealed something extraordinary about the one sitting across from that scarred wooden desk. Harold Martinez had been managing actors for 37 years, and he'd seen every possible reaction to rejection. He'd watched grown men throw phones through windows, seen women collapse into chairs and sob until their mascara ran black rivers down their cheeks, witnessed tantrums that shook the building's foundation. But in all those years, through all those disappointments and shattered hopes, Harold had never seen what Morgan Freeman did that day when the dream role slipped through his fingers like water. The audition had been perfect. Not good, not promising. Perfect. Harold had been in the room that day, watching from the corner as Morgan commanded the space with nothing but his presence and that voice that seemed to emanate from some deeper place than his throat. The casting directors had leaned forward in their chairs. The producer had stopped shuffling through her papers. Even the assistant, who usually spent auditions texting on her phone, had looked up and paid attention. Morgan Freeman had been 42 years old then, old enough to know that opportunities like this didn't come along often, young enough to believe this might be the moment that changed everything. He'd been working steadily for years, taking whatever roles came his way, building his craft one performance at a time in small theaters and smaller films. But this role, this part in what everyone knew, would be a major motion picture. This was different. This was the kind of role that could transform a working actor into a household name. The character was complex, layered, the kind of part that showcased range and depth. More importantly, it was a role that seemed written specifically for Morgan Freeman, even though it wasn't. The way he inhabited the character during that audition, the way he found nuances in the dialogue that the writers probably hadn't even intended, the way he made everyone in that room believe they were watching someone real rather than someone performing. It was extraordinary. Harold had felt confident walking out of that audition room. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize when something special had happened, and something special had definitely happened that day. The casting directors had been effusive in their praise. The director had shaken Morgan's hand and held it just a moment longer than protocol required. There had been talk of callbacks, but the kind of talk that suggested the callback was a formality rather than an actual test. So when the phone call came 3 days later, Harold had answered expecting good news. Instead, he'd received the kind of phone call that had become depressingly familiar over the decades. "Harold, thanks for sending Morgan in. He was fantastic, really fantastic. We were all impressed, but we're going to go in a different direction." A different direction. The phrase that agents and managers learn to hate. The polite way of saying that despite talent, despite perfect auditions, despite everything going right, the answer was still no. Harold had asked the follow-up questions that experience had taught him to ask. Was there feedback? Was there anything Morgan could have done differently? The answers came back predictably vague. It wasn't about Morgan's performance. It was about chemistry, about the overall vision, about factors beyond anyone's control. Harold knew the real answer, though he'd never say it out loud. Hollywood in those years was still a place where certain doors remained stubbornly closed, where talent alone wasn't always enough to overcome the industry's unspoken limitations. Morgan Freeman was exactly the right actor for that role, but he wasn't necessarily the right actor for that role in that movie at that time. It was a truth that hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. Harold had spent the morning after that call trying to decide how to deliver the news. He'd developed a routine over the years for these conversations. First, he'd praise the performance, make sure the actor knew that the rejection wasn't about their talent. Then he'd deliver the news quickly, like pulling off a bandage. Finally, he'd immediately pivot to the next opportunity, the next audition, the next chance to prove themselves. But with Morgan Freeman, something made Harold hesitate. Maybe it was the way Morgan had talked about the role during their preparation sessions, the quiet intensity he'd brought to discussing the character. Maybe it was the fact that Harold genuinely believed this role could have been transformative for Morgan's career. Or maybe it was simply that Harold had grown fond of Morgan over the months they'd worked together, and he dreaded being the bearer of this particular disappointment. Morgan arrived at the office that Tuesday afternoon exactly on time, the way he always did. He wore a simple brown jacket and carried the same worn briefcase he brought to every meeting. Harold noticed that he'd gotten a haircut for the occasion, the kind of small detail that suggested Morgan had been expecting good news. The thought made Harold's stomach tighten. "Harold," Morgan said, settling into the chair across from the desk with that unhurried grace that characterized all his movements. "I assume you have news about the Peterson Project." The Peterson Project. That's what they'd been calling it, never using the real title, maintaining a professional distance even as both men had invested their hopes in it. Harold looked down at the note on his desk, those two simple words that carried so much weight. "Morgan, I need to tell you something." Harold began, then stopped. In 37 years of managing actors, he'd never had trouble finding words before. But something about Morgan's calm expectancy, the way he sat waiting patiently for whatever news Harold had to share, made this moment feel different. "They passed," Harold said finally, the words coming out more bluntly than he'd intended. "The Peterson Project. They're going in a different direction." Harold braced himself for the reaction. In his experience, the bigger the opportunity, the bigger the disappointment. And this had been a very big opportunity indeed. He waited for the anger, the frustration, the questions about why and what went wrong and what they could have done differently. He waited for Morgan Freeman to become smaller in that chair, the way actors did when their dreams collapsed around them. Instead, Morgan was quiet for a long moment, not the stunned quiet of shock, but the thoughtful quiet of someone processing information. His expression didn't change. His posture remained the same. He simply sat there, considering what Harold had told him, with the same measured attention he brought to everything else. "I see," Morgan said eventually. His voice held no trace of bitterness, no edge of anger. It was simply acknowledgement, acceptance of a fact that couldn't be changed. Do we know anything about what they were looking for instead? The question surprised Harold. Most actors, when hit with news like this, wanted to know what they'd done wrong, wanted Harold to fight the decision or demand more information. Morgan was asking about the creative process, about the choices that had been made, as if he were curious about the craft rather than devastated by the outcome. "It wasn't about you," Harold said quickly. "Your audition was excellent, really excellent. Sometimes these things just come down to factors that have nothing to do with talent." Morgan nodded slowly. "I understand that. I'm just curious about their vision. It helps to know what direction they're taking the character, even if I'm not going to be playing him." What happened next would stay with Harold Martinez for the rest of his career. Instead of discussing strategy for moving forward, instead of analyzing what went wrong or planning their next move, Morgan Freeman did something completely unexpected. He asked Harold if he could use the phone. Harold gestured to the phone on his desk, assuming Morgan wanted to call his wife or perhaps cancel other appointments. Instead, Morgan dialed a number from memory and waited for someone to answer. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson. This is Morgan Freeman. I wanted to call and thank you for the opportunity to audition for the Peterson Project." Harold's eyes widened as he realized Morgan was calling the casting director directly. "I know the role is going in a different direction, and I wanted you to know that I understand completely. These decisions are never easy, and I appreciate the time you took to see me." Harold had never heard an actor call to thank someone for rejecting them. He'd heard plenty of actors call to argue, to plead their case, to try to change minds. But to simply express gratitude for the opportunity to audition, to acknowledge the difficulty of the decision, that was something entirely new. Morgan continued the conversation for a few more minutes, asking about the casting director's upcoming projects, expressing genuine interest in her work rather than fishing for future opportunities. When he hung up, he turned back to Harold with the same calm expression he'd worn since walking into the office. "She seemed surprised to hear from me," Morgan said with a slight smile. "I think most actors probably don't call to thank her when they don't get the role." Harold stared at the man sitting across from his desk. In 37 years of this business, he'd never seen anything like it. The grace, the professionalism, the complete absence of ego or entitlement. It was remarkable. But more than that, it was revealing. In that phone call, in those few minutes of conversation, Morgan Freeman had shown Harold exactly who he was beneath the surface. "Morgan," Harold said slowly, "can I ask you something? Aren't you disappointed? This was a big opportunity, the kind of role that could have changed everything for you." Morgan was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. "Harold, I've been thinking about this business for a long time, about what it means to build a career, what it means to be an actor, and I've come to believe that who you are between the roles is just as important as who you are in them." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on that quality that would one day become instantly recognizable to millions of people around the world. "That casting director will remember our conversation, not because I was pushy or because I tried to change her mind, but because I treated her with respect and professionalism, even when I didn't get what I wanted. The next time she has a role that might be right for me, she'll remember that." Harold felt something shift in his understanding. He'd been thinking about this rejection as a setback, a missed opportunity that would need to be overcome. But Morgan was seeing it as part of a larger pattern, a single note in a longer composition. "But beyond that," Morgan continued, "I learned something important in that audition room. I learned that I could handle a role of that complexity, that I could command that kind of space. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because I didn't get the part. It becomes part of who I am as an actor." Harold opened his appointment book, the worn leather cover soft under his fingers. He'd been keeping the same kind of book for decades, a physical record of meetings and auditions and the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that define this business. On the page for today, he'd penciled in Morgan Peterson feedback. Now he found himself writing something completely different. "What are you writing?" Morgan asked, noticing Harold's focused attention on the book. "A note to myself," Harold said, "about what I learned today." Morgan waited patiently for Harold to explain, displaying the same unhurried attention he brought to everything else. It was a quality that Harold was beginning to recognize as central to who Morgan Freeman was. This willingness to be present in moments, to let conversations develop naturally rather than rushing toward conclusions. "I've been in this business for a long time," Harold said finally. "I've seen actors handle rejection in every way you can imagine. Some get angry, some get desperate, some get bitter. Some just give up. But I've never seen anyone handle it like you just did." Harold closed the appointment book and looked directly at Morgan. "The way you just treated that casting director, the way you're sitting here talking about this disappointment, as if it's a learning experience rather than a failure, that tells me something important about who you are. And who you are is going to matter more in the long run than any single role, no matter how big." Morgan smiled, that slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Harold, can I tell you something that might sound strange? I'm actually grateful this happened." Harold raised his eyebrows. "Grateful?" For losing a role that could have made your career? Grateful for the clarity, Morgan said. For the reminder that this business isn't just about getting the part. It's about how you conduct yourself whether you get the part or not. It's about building relationships, learning from every experience, staying true to who you are, regardless of the outcome. Morgan stood up, gathering his jacket and briefcase with the same deliberate care he brought to everything else. I didn't get the Peterson project, that's true. But I got something else today. I got confirmation that I can walk into any audition room and hold my own. I got practice handling disappointment with grace. And I got the knowledge that you and I can work together through anything this business throws at us. After Morgan left that day, Harold sat in his office for a long time, thinking about what he'd witnessed. He'd expected to spend the afternoon managing a crisis, comforting a disappointed actor, strategizing about how to move forward from a significant setback. Instead, he'd been given a masterclass in professionalism and perspective. Harold picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end, his longtime friend and fellow manager, Ruth Kellerman, answered with her usual brisk efficiency. Ruth, it's Harold. Do you have a minute? I need to tell you about something that just happened. For the next 20 minutes, Harold described the afternoon's events to Ruth, trying to capture not just what Morgan Freeman had done, but how he'd done it, the calmness, the thoughtfulness, the complete absence of self-pity or blame. Harold, Ruth said when he finished, in all our years doing this, have you ever had an actor call to thank the casting director who rejected them? Never, Harold admitted. Not once. Then you better hang on to this one, Ruth said. Because what you're describing isn't just talent, it's character. And character is what separates the actors who have careers from the actors who become legends. Harold hung up the phone and opened his appointment book again. On the page for the following week, he began writing down names, casting directors, producers, directors he knew who might have projects suitable for Morgan Freeman. Not because he needed to find Morgan work immediately, but because he wanted to be ready when the right opportunity came along. Because Harold Martinez had learned something that Tuesday afternoon that would guide the rest of his career. Talent was important, certainly. Training and experience mattered. But the quality he'd seen in Morgan Freeman that day, the ability to maintain dignity and grace under pressure, to treat setbacks as learning experiences, to build relationships even in moments of disappointment, that was what separated good actors from great ones. 3 weeks later, Harold's phone rang with an offer for Morgan Freeman, not the lead in a major motion picture, but a supporting role in a smaller film, the kind of part that showcased character acting rather than star power. The role required exactly the kind of quiet authority and thoughtful presence that Morgan had demonstrated in Harold's office that Tuesday afternoon. When Harold called Morgan with the news, he could hear the smile in Morgan's voice. That sounds perfect, Morgan said. When do they need to meet? They don't need to meet, Harold said. The director saw your audition for the Peterson project. The casting director recommended you specifically. There was a moment of quiet on the other end of the line. The same casting director from Peterson? The same one. Apparently, she was very impressed, not just with your audition, but with your follow-up call. She told the director that you were the most professional actor she'd worked with in years. Morgan's laugh was warm and genuine. Well then, I guess that phone call was a good investment after all. Harold found himself smiling as he hung up the phone. That evening, he made another note in his appointment book. Not about meetings or auditions, but about the lesson he'd learned. Sometimes the roles we don't get are just as important as the ones we do. Sometimes disappointment is actually redirection. And sometimes the measure of an actor isn't how they handle success, but how they handle the moments when success slips away. Morgan Freeman went on to build the kind of career that Harold had hoped for from the beginning, though it took a different path than either of them had originally envisioned. The roles that made him famous weren't necessarily bigger than the Peterson Project, but they were better suited to who he was as a person and as an artist. Years later, when interviewers asked Morgan about his approach to the business, he would often talk about the importance of treating every interaction with respect, of viewing setbacks as opportunities to learn, of maintaining perspective even when things didn't go according to plan. He rarely mentioned the specific story of the Peterson Project, but the lessons from that Tuesday afternoon informed every decision he made afterward. Harold Martinez eventually wrote a book about his experiences managing actors. The chapter about Morgan Freeman was titled, "The Day I Learned That Character is Destiny." It became one of the most quoted sections of the book, not because it revealed any industry secrets, but because it captured something essential about what it meant to build a lasting career in a business defined by uncertainty and rejection. The appointment book from that era now sits in Harold's home office, a reminder of the hundreds of actors whose careers he helped guide over the decades. But when he thinks about the lessons he learned in this business, he always comes back to that Tuesday afternoon when Morgan Freeman lost a role and revealed exactly who he was in the process. Because that's what real professionals do. They show you who they are, not when everything goes right, but when everything goes wrong. And on that Tuesday afternoon, when his dream role slipped away like water through his fingers, Morgan Freeman showed Harold Martinez, and anyone paying attention, exactly what kind of man he was behind that voice that would one day narrate the hopes and dreams of the world. The compass pointed north, and Morgan Freeman followed it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else in his life.